books of Moses, the prophets, and sometimes later prophets and former prophets, and writings. It's actually considered 24 books, that's how it's counted. And all 24 books of the Hebrew Bible are represented in this one codex. Codex is another word for book format, because when you talk about a book of a Bible, it could mean a scroll, as in the Dead Sea Scrolls that we were talking about a little bit earlier. From the period of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we had sort of just mentioned, what we enter is a moment, a 700 years, not just a moment, it's called a period of silence. It's a time of silence. What do we mean by silence? What we mean is, at this time, we have no Hebrew books that are still extant. In other words, we have the biblical portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are about 250 fragments, portions of books. I think it comprises, biblical text comprises about 40% of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the rest are other documents and texts. And from the end of the end of the first century, so beginning of the year 200 until the year 900, we basically have no Hebrew books. We have a few small fragments on papyrus, about 150 of legal documents, tiny little pieces. We have one fragment of a Torah scroll that's been dated to the 8th century. We basically have nothing, and nobody knows why this period of silence exists. It's 700 years. The scholars, they really have no idea. Either the Jews were in Babel, in Babylonia, and the books just were lost over time, which is one possibility, or there was a very strong emphasis on orality, on passing things down orally, verbally, by hearing, and that's why we don't have it. We do believe that there were codices, books in codex format, by the 9th century. One of the proofs we have is that there was a Bible called, it's a portion of the Bible, it's actually the prophets, called the Ben Asher Codex. And this Ben Asher Codex has a colophon. A colophon is a small paragraph that comes at the end of a text. At the end of a long manuscript, you have a paragraph. And it's the scribe's way of saying where and when the book was written. Manuscripts don't have title pages. Title pages are a function of printing. The first Hebrew title page is not until 1507 Fano, I think, right? That's the first title page is 1507 Fano, if I remember correctly. And Jonathan's a colleague in books and manuscripts, and I think that's right. So what does a colophon tells us? Colophon would go something like this, a very standard format. It says, I, Samuel, the son of David, the scribe, wrote this book for Abraham, the son of Isaac, and may he and his children and his children's children, it actually says his sons and his sons of sons, but use it for many generations to come, and may they all be blessed, etc. Okay, this book does not have such a colophon. We have the last part of the Hebrew Bible. There may have been other pages after that had a colophon that are lost, the same way that there are about 5 folios in the beginning that are missing, but we don't have that here. This Ben Asher Codex had a colophon of 895. However, the book does not date to 895 because scholars have decided within the last 20 years that the scribe who was copying the text was copying an earlier colophon, and that book was actually about 150 years or maybe more later. So we know that in the 9th century they were already creating codices. When did Jews adopt this codex form? It's a good question. We have scrolls, we have biblical books on scrolls at the time of the Dead Sea Scroll. In the Christian world, we have the adoption of the codex format, book format, in the 2nd century. Why were they adopting the codex format? Because if you had a Bible and you wanted to spread the good word, it was a heck of a lot easier to turn the pages than it was to roll it from one end of the Bible to the other. If you started rolling it and you're looking in Genesis, you want to show them something toward the end of Numbers, you'd be, by the time you got to Numbers, the person would be long gone. You wouldn't be able to show them proofs from the Bible. It made it very much easier to do this in codex format. the Jews were living, the bulk of the Jewish community was living in Islamic lands. In this period, they were living in Syria, which was under Islamic rule from 634 to 640, I believe it was conquered. They were living in the land of Israel, which was also under Islamic rule at this period. They were living in Bavel, in Babylonia, which is Iraq. They were living in Persia, and the Muslims adopted the Codex format in the 7th, 8th century. So they adopted it much later. Sorry, you say? Are you? I thought you wanted to ask something? No. Oh, okay, that's fine. So hello. They adopted it much later, and we believe that the Jews who were living in Islamic lands adopted this format as in the 8th, 9th century, but we only have proof of it from this book. This is the earliest, most complete Hebrew Bible, and we find it in codex format. So this is kind of a revolution in book production, and it's also a revolution in the way that they transmitted the biblical text. Why so? Because the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Hebrew text is there, but there are no vowel points, right? There are no nekudot, and there are no ta'amim, there's no cantillation marks. So what's going on between the year 200 and the year 900? What's going on is there are a group of scribe scholars known as Masoretes who are living primarily in the town of Tiberias, and some of them were living in Babylonia. And they felt that it was critically important to create a correct and standardized Hebrew Bible. And what did they do to do this? What they did was they created 3 systems. Okay? They created a system of vowel points, right? Nikudot, that go above and below the letters. This tells you how the words are to be pronounced. And I may have explained this earlier, and perhaps, I don't know if everybody knows this, but you could have, Hebrew is a consonantal language, and so the same 3 letters, Samach Pei Resh, could mean several different things. It could mean Sefer, it could meaning a book, it could mean Sofer, meaning a scribe, it could mean to declare, the Saper, it could mean to count. It all depends how the vowels go. The Dead Sea Scrolls don't have those vowels. Like the Torah scrolls today, when you get up to read a Torah scroll, unless you've studied it beforehand from a text like this, you actually don't know which way to pronounce the word because the vowels aren't there. You can't include vowels in a Torah scroll. So these scribes living between the 6th and the 9th century created a system of vowel points, also created a system of cantillation, ta'amim, accent marks, which told you how the text was to be sung and how to parse the text exactly. And finally, they created a system of notes. And these notes are twofold. One run above and below the text. These are known as Masorah, as the word actually means tradition. And this is Masorah Magna, the larger body of Masorah. And they created Masorah Parva, the smaller notes that go in between the columns. It's kind of a shorthand. What do these notes tell us? They tell us how the words are supposed to be spelled, if they're spelled differently in one place than in another. How many times they appear in the Bible. They tell us whether they appear in another form. There's something called Kriyu Ketiv, which means they are read one way but written another way. There's something called Ketiv Velo Kri. It works in both directions, how it's written and how it should be read. And this ensured that a scribe, and in fact one scribe did write this entire text, would copy the text correctly. So what you have is you go from the Dead Sea Scrolls without any of this critical apparatus to 700 years later, this earliest, most complete text. So it's really astonishing. It appears kind of full-blown, and we don't see how they get to this moment. What we see only is the final creation. This Bible, they stabilized the text of the Hebrew Bible, and this Bible is as we have it today, exactly as we have it today. This week we read different, every week in the synagogue on Sabbath we read a different portion of the Bible, and we're going to be reading Truma this week, and you open up Truma over here where it talks about the dedication of the gifts to the tabernacle, and it is exactly as you will find it in the synagogue if you go there on Saturday morning. What's kind of interesting is that this was written at a time when the Bible in the Middle East was read on a triennial cycle. So nowadays we read the Pentateuch, the Torah, on an annual cycle, right? We start in Bereshit after Simchat Torah, and we end, right, V'zot HaBracha, a year later, and then we celebrate the completion of the written Bible. This, in the land of Israel, it was read over 3 years, as opposed to 1 year. And so later on, because this is a study Bible, a scribe came and put pays to indicate the parsha marks so that people who were studying this would know this is Truma, this is Tzava, this is Tazria Mitzora, etc., and they would know where to begin. There are no chapters in these books, in the early books. Chapters are a later invention of Christendom. Archbishop Stephen Langton, he's Archbishop of Canterbury, I believe, created a system of chapters, mostly because the Bible was one of the chief books of study in early universities. And in order to be able to tell your students where to turn the pages, it's much easier if you've got chapter and verse, right? Like you say, you read them chapter and verse, that's where it comes from. He didn't invent verses. Verses actually even later. We do have stop marks in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and here, like we can tell where the verses are, but actual numbered verses are even later. So we have this Masoretic text. Okay, what happens with this Bible? It's written around the year 900, and about 100 years after it's written, we have a deed of sale. I'm going to show that to you here. As soon as I get that. And here we have it. And I actually have one that I can pass around. Excuse me, what?
It's bound in the Bible.
It is, yes. So people ask, why is the deed of sale in the middle here, right? And that's a very good question. And the deed of sale is in the middle here because sometimes they thought to themselves, gee, if I put it at the end, it's going to get lost. Often the first and last pages get lost. And so therefore they put it in the middle, and I'll pass it around so people can read it. Actually, it's hard to read because it's in Judeo-Arabic. But you can see it, and you can see parts of it, and what you'll see is Chalaf ben Abraham, Chalaf, the son of Abraham, Sahib, he was an important businessman, sells this book to Isaac ben Ezekiel Alatar. Alatar is a last name indicating that he was either a perfumist or he was a pharmacist, or maybe he dealt in spices. That was the term for people who dealt in those areas. So he was handling precious materials. And it's a very formal deed of sale, and he says these 24 books are going into the possession of Isaac ben Ezekiel Alatar, and actually it's written by a scribe, and the scribe signs his name over here on the last line. His name is Tzedakah ben Daniel HaYerushalmi, Tzedakah ben Daniel. And then the actual deed is witnessed by this individual over here. His name is Mubarak, actually, even Rahib Kohen, okay? So we have a formal deed of sale around the year 1000, and after that, Isaac ben Ezekiel passes it to his sons, and he gives it to them in a very formal manner, and that's written over here. He says that his sons, Ezekiel and Maimun, are to take this book as a trust, and they're not to sell it, and they're not to redeem it forever, and that's what it says. So the book passes into the hands of his son.
Is that the complete book?
This is the entirety of the Bible, beginning in Genesis, but it's missing the first 10 chapters of Genesis. So it has every book of the Bible, but it is missing the first 10 chapters and then about 3 chapters further in.
Is it the same order as we have it today?
No, it's not. It's not the same order. The 5 books of Moses are in the same order, and then come the early prophets, but the later prophets are Chronicles comes in the middle,
And
rather than at
Ketuvim
the
as
end.
well,
Like
also.
here you see we're in Divrei Hayamim, Chronicles, and you can see there's still, it comes after Samuel, rather than at the end. Okay.
So at what point did we decide to rejig so that the order?
The Talmud gives us the order that we're following nowadays, but the Talmud is kind of a Babylonian creation. Yeah. This was created in the, here, I'm just going to find this for you 1 second. 67 is what I need. Okay, so then we have another dedication over here. This is the 31st choir, right? The book is composed of lots of choirs, and it says Kadosh LaHashem Elokei Yisrael. This is consecrated, dedicated, holy to the God, Lord of Israel. Okay, and then 10 pages in, it tells us a bit more information. 10 pages in, we find out where is it dedicated. La Kenisa Makisim Lo Yimkor. Okay, so this is dedicated to a synagogue in the town of Makisim. Now, let's step back 1 minute. This is composed 792 pages, but actually 400 sheets of parchment, right? Normally, when you talk about a book, a manuscript, it's foliated, like the Gemara that we have, which has a folio number, one leaf, side A and side B, or Amud Aleph, Amud Bet, or recto or verso. But David Solomon Sassoon paginated his book, so we're going by page numbers in case any of you are wondering. So this is all written by one scribe on these massive amounts of folios. This is an expensive object to produce. You needed several hundred sheepskins. I mean, you couldn't just wake up one morning and say, gee, I'd like a Bible. You had to pay a scribe to sit and write it for a year and a half maybe, and you had to order the sheepskins. I mean, this is an enormous expensive undertaking. Only the wealthiest of the wealthy could purchase such a Bible.
And would it have been given all in one? Would it have been put together? Would he have written it and given it one go? He didn't write bits of it and then piece by piece.
No, it's not like printing where you hand out choir by choir as sometimes as it gets printed. No, this was. I mean, we don't actually know. I mean, maybe he gave it over, but it was kind of bound in one. There's no indication that it was bound in several volumes. Right. So it seems that he was writing it and then finished it and gave it in. So where is this synagogue in Makisim? We searched 3 weeks for it, couldn't find it anywhere. And finally, we were clued into the fact that it's now the town called Makada, or Makada, which is on the Khyber River in northeastern Syria. And we don't actually know why there's no mention of this town in Jewish sources except for one reference, one glancing reference that's made to it. You would think a town with the resources to have this dedicated to the synagogue of that town would be fairly well known. I mean, the other city where we have the sort of an equally important Bible is the Aleppo Codex, right? It's named for Aleppo. It was actually written in Tiberias, and then the Aleppo Codex was taken to Jerusalem in the Karaite synagogue of Jerusalem. It was looted by the Crusaders, not this book, I'm talking about the Aleppo Codex. It was looted by the Crusaders in 1099. It was ransomed by the Jews of Egypt and taken down to Egypt. Maimonides examined that book in Egypt, and that book, which was written around 930, so contemporaneous to this, was then taken up to Aleppo and donated and dedicated to the synagogue of Aleppo. They kept it locked up. Very few people had access to it. I think they took it out once a year on Simchat Torah, is what I'm told, and that's where it was kept. So how is it that we know nothing about Makisim? There's one reference. There is an individual by the name of Avadja Hager. Avadja Hager is a proselyte who converts from Christianity to Judaism. He was a Norman priest in Italy, and he moves to the Middle East where it was a little safer for him. And he's passing through. He's going from Aleppo to Baghdad, and on the way he stops in the town of Makisim, and he records that in his diary. Why we know nothing about it, it's hard to say. One of the reasons we may know nothing about it is because of this inscription at the very end, and I'll pass that around as well. I can find it. It's gone missing again. So there's an inscription here on this page. It's also in Judeo-Arabic. Let's see if I can find it. If not, I'll just have to get it quickly here. And this inscription is kind of poignant. What it tells us is that the Bible changes hands again. And we think that it was dedicated to the synagogue based on paleography in the 13th century. And the 14th century witnessed a lot of conflict in this area of Syria. The Mongols came through in the first part of the 14th century, and then Tamerlane comes through around the year 1400. He's going exactly the same route as Obadiah Hager. He's moving from Aleppo through Baghdad, but he's not destroying as much because at that point, Tamerlane was so feared, as soon as he pulled up to the towns, they capitulated immediately and surrendered. But this inscription, which I thought I'd be able to find out, I think it was here earlier. Somebody found it for me. No. This inscription says that this Bible is now entrusted to the hands of a Jew by the name of Shlomo Ibn al-Fachar. And he and his heirs are told that they must watch over it until such time as the synagogue in Makisim will be reconstituted. And when that time comes, it's dedicated to the synagogue of Makisim, and they must give it back. And then the trail goes cold for 500 years. We don't know where this book is. So, like, here we have the most significant book in this foundational book of certainly Western civilization, the Bible, and the earliest, most complete text of all 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, with the Nikudot and the Ta'amim, the vowels, and the Mesorah. And we don't know where it is for 500 years. And the next time it turns up in Europe. It's being offered for sale to Aaron Freiman. Aaron Freiman was the chief librarian, Judiaca librarian in the Staatsbibliothek in Frankfurt. And he was offered this Bible, and he was offered it for 600 pounds, Great British, well, actually, yeah, 600 Great British pounds. I don't know how much that translated to in German marks at that time. And he decides not to buy it. We don't know why. And what he does is he writes to David Solomon Sassoon and he said, look, this is a really important Bible and you should buy it. And, you know, we wanted to know who's offering to him, like, where's it been? And we went looking for Aaron Freiman's notes. And he was, as I mentioned earlier, a German librarian, right? He probably would have recorded who was offering him this Bible somewhere, as Germans and librarians are wont to do. But he fled Nazi Germany, and all of his papers were lost, except for a very few that are now located in Union College, Cincinnati. Go figure. We don't know why it ended up there. It's an important early library, but he was in New York. Aaron Freiman was, so we don't know where his papers are. We think that most of them were lost. And David Sassoon buys it in 1929, rebinds it, fixes the edges of the paper, and holds on to it. And it's one of his most beloved books. It's actually also one of the most expensive books that he purchased. He kept a diary of all of the books that he purchased. He had 1,274 books. He compiled an extremely erudite catalog of his books. He wrote it himself. He was quite the scholar. He was also the most important collector of Hebrew manuscripts in the world. Some might say for all times. There's some competition between him and David Oppenheim, but who lived a few centuries earlier. But suffice it to say that he was a very important, knowledgeable collector. His catalog ends at manuscript 1053, and he ends his catalog with this book. He kind of begins it with Bibles and ends it with Bibles. And this had a pride of place. There are only 4 other books that he paid more money for in his entire collection of Hebrew manuscripts, which is saying something. He dies in 1942, and his heirs sell it in 1978 via Sotheby's Circa. It's bought by the British Rail Pension Fund, a fact which sort of amuses everybody here, but will make no dent to anybody elsewhere in the world. The British Rail Pension Fund buys it as an investment, as they did other art and sculpture and other Hebrew books and other manuscripts, not just Hebrew books and manuscripts. They do very well for their pension holders because they sell it about 10 years later for 3 times the price, for $3.19 million. It's bought for about $320,000. It's 550,000 Swiss francs, and that translated to about, I think that was hammer, and translated to about $320,000 with premium. In 1978, they sell it in 1989, and at that point it's bought by Jacques Safra, And he enjoyed owning it for 3 decades. I'm sorry, I'm getting all tired here. He'd like to have owned it for 3 centuries, but nobody's that old. And the Bible is that old. He owned it for about 3 decades and is now bringing it to auction because he wants to share this treasure and move it on to the next institution or private individual, which will keep it safe for the next many years. And that is a pretty good overview of the history of the biblical text and why this is important. But if you have questions, please ask, and after that we're going to put it back in the case. So
no clues at all about who commissioned this Bible?
No. It's kind of so I'll say one thing about it. All of the early 10th and 11th century Bibles, or portions of Bibles that we have, were written either in Egypt, Israel, or Syria. That's kind of where we have them from. After that, it spreads to Europe. The first European Bible, I think, Codex is only 1102 or 1105. It's considerably later. It's already into the 12th century. And Egypt is the place where we have the Cairo Geniza. I think many of you will be familiar with the Cairo Geniza. There's an enormous repository of documents. A Geniza is a Jewish concept where sacred documents are supposed to be stored away and not just disposed of. What happened in Egypt was in Cairo, the synagogue of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Fustat, Old Cairo, had such a repository. But it didn't only keep sacred documents with God's name, Bibles and prayer books, it also was a repository for anything written in Hebrew characters, even Judeo-Arabic. So we have travelers' letters and merchants' accounts and wives complaining about their husbands and ketubot. Anything you could think of in Jewish life between, kind of the 10th and 13th century and onwards was found in the Cairo Geniza. And the Cairo Geniza was most famously most of it, the largest portion of it was purchased by Salman Schechter and brought back to Cambridge. Other large portions are in the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. The Bodleian Library was there early. So these biblical codices were in Egypt, and we know quite a bit more about it because the scribes are found in the Cairo Geniza. This does not have the name of a scribe, and we can't match the writing to anybody in the Cairo Geniza. And not only that, but the deed of sale, that name of the scribe, Tzedakah ben Daniel, he doesn't appear anywhere else in the Cairo Geniza. So the thinking is, if this book would have been in Egypt in any time, we would have had the names of the people who owned it would have appeared because they were the wealthiest of individuals, and the scribes' names get recorded. So this must have been Israel or Syria, and that stuff doesn't show up in the Cairo Geniza. Certainly not as much. You do have some letters. Other questions?
It's the fact that, does it has at all any gold or any decoration?
No, so
any kind
these
of,
early 10th century Bibles
don't
don't have anything. The Aleppo Codex has nothing at all. It's not, and one of the reasons that I mentioned this earlier book called the Ben Asher Codex, which is the prophets, which had a colophon to 895. People thought it was early, but it has all sorts of decoration. In the last 20 years, scholars said, no, that's not really 895. That's actually 200 years later. And none of these early Bibles have that kind of decoration. Not until the 12th century.
Does it mean something? Does it mean that the buyer was like
11th century, I should say. The Leningrad Codex in
is
1008
it that,
has decorations.
Is it that purposely, or does it mean anything about the class of the buyer or whatever?
I
Because
think
this is a big work.
it's a huge work. Yes, no
Exactly.
one.
I would have assumed that somebody who has
Extremely
money,
wealthy. I think what's going on is that this is the beginning of the tradition of Hebrew codices. We go from the scroll period of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mentioned we had 700 years of basic silence where we have no codices. Codices emerge full blown, astonishingly, in the in the 9th century, end of the 9th century. We really only have evidence from the 10th century. And these biblical codices from the 10th century are not decorated. I think they're just beginning to emerge onto their own as books of that period. So, other questions?
Yes, just to clarify, you mentioned the Nucleodot, the notes, etc., were introduced at a later date. The Nucleodot and the pronunciations
Yes.
introduced at a later date.
So what I meant by later date was we have the Dead Sea Scrolls without vowel points and without cantillation. And the Masoretes between the 6th and the 9th century are constructing this system of nikudot and of vowel points and ta'amim cantillation, and they're constructing the Masoretic annotations, the notes on top and on bottom. This is the first time that we see the work of the Masoretes in a codex format, complete, almost complete, right?
Yeah, we have no evidence of their work.
We don't have the early evidence. This is, yeah, I mean, there are Bibles. There's a Bible that's actually dated 903, 908. That's only a Chumash, which has the same evidence, but as a complete work, beginning to end, this is it. Yeah.
So when you were saying about the Ketiv and Kari, are you saying that this is indicated in here?
Yes, very much so. Very much so.
Right.
Yeah, that's part of it.
Do we have any other codices? I mean, these think of
So
the
there-
Sifra. I mean,
No.
Is
This
that
is
not a
this is
code?
only biblical.
no, but there are earlier codices, Hebrew codices or not? Are the Sifra? I don't know.
There's nothing. There's a scroll, a portion of the scroll that's been carbon dated to the 8th century, I believe. It's, I think, Devarim and Bamidbar, if I remember.
No, but I mean
correctly.
codex wise. There's no codex.
So,
like
as a
Sifra.
codex,
There's something of Sifra, I don't know
no, I don't think that's been dated. What there is, that I think everybody so far accepts, hasn't been widely published. There's a very small, it's about this big, a prayer book that's been dated to the 8th century, but it's not quite public yet. It belongs to the Museum of the Bible. It was part of the Afghanistan Geniza. It was found in a cave in Afghanistan, probably came from Babylonia. It's an astonishing thing in its own right, but like scholars are still studying it. But that has been, that's like the first thing where we see with leaves as a codex earlier. Yeah, we don't have codices dated, firmly dated before the beginning of the 10th century. This is carbon dated, late 9th, early 10th, but I think 903 is the earliest codex.
Does it look like a single hand?
Yes, no, it's one scribe throughout. It's one scribe absolutely throughout the entire book. Yeah.
And you know the Babylonian version where like maybe the notations are sort of above more.
Mhm.
Are they dated later than this? Or?
There are Babylonian versions from the 10th century, but I don't think they're as comprehensive.
Yeah.
One could look for that. I think I think I was starting to answer you, but a lot of the other early biblical codices are all found, not entire books of the Bible, but portions, prophets, later prophets, earlier prophets. The Leningrad Codex itself, which is 1008, so 11th century, are found in St. Petersburg right now, because the earliest person in to collect these books from Egypt, from Cairo, was a Karaite by the name of Abraham Firkovich, who was a character and a half. And he was a leader of the Karaite Jews. Karaite sort of broke off or kind of separated themselves from the Rabbinite Jews, and only followed the biblical text. Didn't follow the rabbinical kind of legal system. They created their own legal system in the end, but they were deeply invested in the biblical text. And Firkovich bought these manuscripts because he got there first. He got there in the 1840s, 1850s, I think, and brought them back to St. Petersburg. And his collection eventually ended up in St. Petersburg. And why was I going there? I don't remember why you were asking. And I think some of the Babylonian systems are in that.
And to push the point, the Masorah does look like the same hand, even though it's much smaller.
So that is a very good point that you're making. The scholars have looked at this. Judah Schlanger and Yossi Ofer. Yossi Ofer is the world's leading scholar on Masorah. He's actually been studying this for 5 years. There are two sets of Masorah here. There's one hand, which was the same hand as the scribe, and there's another one that goes over the hand of the first Masorah. They differ as to why this happened. Yossi Ofer thinks that the second scribe came along, scraped off the work, and decided to include his own, which was fuller and more comprehensive. And Judah Schlanger says that the work of the first Masran, the first math scribe, who was also the scribe of the Bible, flaked, and we can see examples of the flaking here, right? And so a second Masran came and wrote over it. So the question is one of intent. Was it a sort of intentional erasure, or was it just the Bible got sold and somebody said, I've got to fix this? So we don't know. But it is one hand throughout, and the first iteration of the Masorah is one hand throughout. Normally, in later periods, when you have a biblical codex of this size, you could have several people working on it. And we know from the colophons, this paragraph at the end where they talk about who's created the book and for whom, you could have a sofer who writes the main text, you could have a nakdan who vocalizes it, and you could have a masran, and they all write their own separate colophons. In this case, in this early period, it was the same person. Yeah. Other questions?
You said the parchment was made from sheepskin.
Yes.
The ink?
Some of it is carbon, and I think the later is iron gall. So iron galls come from gall nuts, and carbon is from ash and from the carbon.
Do we want to wrap this?
Yeah, come around. People who have been in front, why don't you let the people who have been outside take a look at
Thank
it?
you very much. Thanks.
So you're welcome, then we're
Yeah.
going to put it back as it is, as per security. This book was written when the Bible was read over the course of 3 years, not the whole Bible, I'm talking about just the 5 books of Moses. And so it has Sidarim, it has, excuse me? No, it has the orders are broken down otherwise, but somebody came sort of within 100 or 200 years after this book was written, and they put little pays. Pei is the first letter of the word parasha, and that tells you where you begin reading this next, next
annual installment.
On the annual installment, yeah, because, so somebody asked if there are no chapters or verses, how do you find your way around?
Yes.
No, so it's interesting, it's not that easy. I had a wonderful woman here who asked me what chapter this is on.
Yeah.
So the book here is Divrei Hayamim. So anybody that grows up within the Orthodox community of Judaism knows that nobody reads Divrei Hayamim. Like, we just don't read Divrei Hayamim. So it's Chronicles. It's just not. It's considered a recap of Samuel and Kings, and it's just not a book that's read. I don't know why. Like, we memorize lots of other parts of the Bible. Right. So I was about to say. So
I think the reason, sorry, is that all the information given the book of Kings and the book of Samuel.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. I was saying it's just not read on an annual basis, but it is read by Christians, and particularly what I thought was really wonderful was people say, why did I open it up here? And I did open it up here because this is a point where it shows that it was dedicated to a synagogue in the city of Lachisin, but it actually happens to be the 20th and 21st chapter of Chronicles. So when I was asked this, I didn't know. Like, some of the things I know, this is Genesis, this is chapter that of Exodus, and I was quickly looking up on my phone, okay, where is this in Chronicles? And it turns out to be the 20th and 21st chapter of Chronicles, which is what they're reading right now in the Jehovah's Witness Church, which is kind of, so I taught them the word bashert, which means synergy in Hebrew. It's like sort of very synergistic. It's already, I think, but you're welcome to hear it. Oh, you right at the end? Oh, good, okay. I was wondering about repeating myself. I was like, it's nice. I try to add one new thing to every talk, but I don't always succeed, so we'll see. This is what you're standing in front of, the earliest, most complete Hebrew Bible extant in the world. There may have been earlier books. There certainly was another manuscript of this comparable age called the Aleppo Codex, which was written at about the same time and place, which is around the year 900. Either in the land of Israel or Syria. The Aleppo Codex was written in Tiberias. This we don't actually know. But the Aleppo Codex, as we have it now, is missing most of the Pentateuch. It starts in Deuteronomy, toward the end of Deuteronomy. And this, as it has representations of every single book of the Hebrew Bible, from Genesis all the way to the end, there are 24 books in the Hebrew Bible, is the earliest, most complete example of the Hebrew Bible as we have it today. It's also in one codex. There are other sort of manuscripts from the 10th century which have parts of the Hebrew Bible, but nothing in one complete codex as you see it. And what makes this of extreme significance and importance is not only is it the text of the Hebrew Bible, but also what we have here are the systems of vowels, nikudot, and ta'amim, cantillation marks. And these systems, and as we also have the system of Masoretic notes, I'll explain more about that in a minute. And these critical systems, which were created between the 6th and the 7th century, the 6th and the 9th century, I should say, ensured the accurate and correct transmission of the Hebrew Bible and stabilized, standardized the text of the Hebrew Bible as we know it today. And this is the earliest, most complete example of that. Full stop. From around the year 600. We know that it's around the year 600 because it was carbon dated to 880 to around 960. And the lead scholars of Hebrew manuscripts in the world, Judah Schlanger, said, instead of late 9th, early 10th century, why don't you just say circa 900? And that's what we're doing. But in order to explain why this manuscript is of such importance, what I need to do is to step back several hundred years and explain to you what existed beforehand. Because it's important to note why this Bible is of such critical importance in the transmission of the text of the Hebrew Bible. So the earliest fragments of the Hebrew Bible that we have are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'll just hold that up 1 minute, right? And this is an example of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1947 in caves. It's sort of near the Dead Sea, right, in the Judean hills. And what you see when you look at this parchment is the book of Exodus. Is actually the 10 Commandments, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are very fragmentary. Whereas all books of the Hebrew Bible are represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls, except for the book of Esther. The book of Esther doesn't appear there. Some of them, are represented in here, and you can sort of pass that around. You know what the Dead Sea Scrolls look like, Karen. Karen is here from the National Library of Israel, which is very exciting. Am I allowed to say that? Yeah, okay, fine, sure. If you want to know anything about the National Library of Israel after I finish speaking, go speak to Karen.
I think I'd have to really...
Okay, leave shortly. Well, then you won't. Okay, that's fine. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are hard to read. They're hard to read because they have no vowels. They have no cantillation marks. Hebrew is a consonantal language, so the same 3 letters could be written the same way, samach pei resh, but understood differently. The word samach pei resh could be sefer, book, sofer, scribe, could be lesaper, to declare. It could mean many different things. Unless you have the vowels, you don't actually know what the word is. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written without this system, without the system of cantillation, which tells you how to chant the text. And this period of Dead Sea Scrolls goes from about the 3rd century before the Common Era until the end of the 1st century of the Common Era. So about the year 200, this period of writing of biblical texts is over. And at that point, what we have is we enter a silent period. From the year 200 approximately to the year 900 approximately, we have 7 centuries of nothing. Basically nothing. There's one fragment of a Torah scroll in Cambridge which has been dated to the 8th century. There are a few papyrus documents that are like tiny little fragments that are legal documents that have been published. But basically there's 700 years where we have no Hebrew books. Between this period, what we have, Karen, before you leave, I'm going to give you one thing. So when you walk out, just come by and I'll give you something. What we have from this period is a group of scribe scholars who begin working in the 6th century and continue through the 9th century. And these scribe scholars are living in several places, primarily the city of Tiberias. And they are considering how to create the most accurate standardized text of the Hebrew Bible. As the divine word of God, it is important to be able, or they certainly considered it important to be able to transmit the Holy Word of God correctly and accurately. In this book that we have here, which represents the earliest, most complete example in codex form of every book of the Hebrew Bible, it's written on 792 pages. It's paginated, even though manuscripts are usually talked about as folios, like each leaf, and because David Solomon Sassoon paginated it, so we're kind of stuck with that. But that would have represented an extreme outlay of money in order to be able to create this. These were very precious objects, documents. They were luxurious documents. This would have constituted about 200 sheepskin. And it's one scribe sitting and writing for at least a year, perhaps 2 years, we don't know exactly, to be able to create this text. What we see in this text is the work of these scribe scholars known as Masoretes. And Masoretes is from the Hebrew term Masorah, meaning tradition. And what they were doing was they were concretizing the oral tradition of how the Bible should be read and how it should be written accurately. And in order to do this, they created 3 systems. They created the system of nikud, which means vowels. They added little points above and below the lines, and you can sort of see that here if you come a little closer, and I'll pass this around. They added cantillation marks, which are how the Bible is meant to be chanted, but also tells you where to stop in the middle of a sentence, and sometimes how the sentence is parsed and how it's read tremendously affects the meaning. And they also added a series of notes above and below the pages of the margins of the above and below the text of the Bible, and you can see that over here, above and below, and also between the columns. This system of notes tells us how often words appear, in what form they appear, how they're correctly to be written, how they're to be pronounced. There's something known as kriyukativ. You write it one way, but you pronounce it another way, and that fills almost every page of this Bible. And I'll pass that around so people can read it. But actually, according to scholars, there were 2 campaigns of writing these notes, and on some pages, a second scribe has come and scraped off the notes, and you see it scraped off over here, because he wanted to add his own notes. So that's what you see going on here within 100 years of when the Bible was written. Yossi Ofer has been studying this for the last 5 years. He is a great scholar of Masoretic texts, and he and Judah Schlanger actually are having a machloket, a scholarly dispute. Yossi Ofer thinks that they were scraped off intentionally because a second scribe wanted to enhance the text of the Masorah, and Judah Schlanger thinks that they flaked off and someone came and prepared the pages. So we don't exactly know why. There's kind of a dispute about that. So in this book, what we have is what we see now after 700 years of silence, the earliest, most complete text of the Hebrew Bible. It is the only one that exists from the 10th century, comparable to the Aleppo Codex, but containing every book of the Bible. People ask what's missing. The first 10 chapters are missing, as well as another 3 chapters a little bit earlier, a little bit between pages 22 and 23. Let me know when you have to go.
Sorry, everybody.
Take this back. If you could just take that back here. Thank you. The National Library.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Just hand it over to them. They'll see me in Israel, yeah? The Bible is going on display in Israel for people who know anybody who might want to see it there, March 22nd to March 30th. It'll be on display in Los Angeles and Dallas, and then it's going to be on display in New York between May 7th and May 16th. It's going on sale in New York in the week of May 16th. But to get back to the history of this Bible, we know it was written around the year 900, and we have a deed of sale that appears on page 373. And this deed of sale records that Chalaf ben Abraham is selling this book to Isaac, the son of Ezekiel. And they call it a mischaf. Mischaf comes from the Arabic word of a codex, right? Because prior to this period, we have parts of the Hebrew Bible in scroll, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls are in scroll format and quite fragmentary. And in the Roman and Christian world, there was a move from scroll to codex, right? From the time when books were written in scroll format to the time when they appear in what we think of as a book, but it's actually, the correct term would be a codex. And this occurs in the first, in kind of the second, third century of the Common Era. In the Islamic world, this use of a codex format begins when they began to write down the Quran. And we have examples of this, I think, from the 8th century, and the Jews, who were primarily living in Islamic lands at that time, adopted the codex form, and we have evidence that they were using this form in the 9th century. We don't actually have any material physical evidence of codices before the 9th century, and this is, in fact, as a book, one of the earliest codices that we have. It's not dated, it's carbon dated, but it doesn't have an actual scribal date in it. But this is an example of what these early manuscripts look like, and the earliest books that we have of this period of the 10th and 11th century are Bibles. They're primarily Bibles, because that's what they were. When they wanted to spend money and hire a scribe and spend money for 200 sheepskin. The thing that they were spending money on was the Bible. Almost primarily, we have some early prayer books and documents of this period, but most of the books remaining from the 10th century are Bibles. So the book gets sold by Chalaf ben Avraham, and Isaac, the son of Ezekiel, then passes it on to his children. His children are called Ezekiel and Maimun, and he gives it to them in a very kind of constricted fashion. He says that they are never to sell it. It's kind of like he gives it to them in a trust, and no, they may never sell it. They have to guard it and watch it, and it's to be theirs for the next many generations. For those of you who can read Hebrew, this is the original deed of sale. Well, not the original. This is a deed of sale from the year 1000. We don't know what happened between 900 and 1000, and above is the transfer of ownership to his sons. However, it's open to this page over here because we find on later pages in the Bible, and people have asked me actually why the deed of sale was smack in the middle on page 373, and the answer to that is often if you write things on the last pages of the book, it gets lost, yeah. So sometimes we find important inscriptions in the middle of books because they figure those pages are less likely to get lost. If you have something that's important and you want to make sure that it stays there, you put it somewhere in the middle. And also, there was a nice free page over here between books. I've got to figure out what this is between. I think this is the end of Kings. And actually, it's written by a scribe, Stakad ben Daniel, so it's kind of a very formal deed of sale, and then witnessed by Mubarak ben Vahib Kohen. Mubarak was Mevarach. He was a Jew, and that's just the way that he signed his name below. So we find on page 567, there's another inscription on top, and it says, Kadosh LaHashem Elokei Yisrael, that this is dedicated to the Lord God of Israel. And then 10 folios later, there's a continuation in the same hand, and it says, La Kanisa Makisin Lo Yimkor. This is dedicated where? To the Kanisa, which was the term used for synagogue, Makisin, the town of Makisin, Lo Yimkor. So in fact, the children of Isaac somehow transferred ownership. We don't know where they were, but we know that the next time this appears, it is in the synagogue of Makisin, and what you're going to ask me is, where is Makisin? You've heard this already, I think, once or twice. Let's see if I change it on the way up here. All right, if you have any questions, please ask. I feel like I should add something new here. Makisin is a town that we spent a good 3 weeks looking for, and we couldn't find it. One of the reasons we couldn't find it was because the town's name was changed to Markada. Markada is a city in northeast Syria on the Khyber River, and you would have thought that this city would have contained an important and influential and wealthy community of Jews, and we would have heard about it. But in fact, nobody knows anything about the Jewish community of Makisin. And why do I say that it would have contained an important and influential community? Because if a book of this significance and importance is dedicated to a synagogue in a town, one has to assume that there was a significant Jewish population, or at least some kind of population that could have looked after it. You don't dedicate something to a place where it's not going to be looked after. These books were so important that the kind of affectionate nickname that they were given, these early Bibles, is crown. In Hebrew, it's Taj. In Arab, if you're recording this, you've got to knock out the mistakes. In Arabic, the Hebrew term for crown is Taj, and it was called Al-Taj. In Hebrew, the term is Keter, and these early books are called in Hebrew Keter Aram Sova, which is the Aleppo Codex. It's the crown of Aleppo. Or they could be called Keter Damesek. That's another manuscript that's in the National Library of Israel. It's a Pentateuch. It's the crown of Damesek. We've affectionately called this Keter Sassoon. And the reason is because David Solomon Sassoon, whom we'll get to in a minute, was the most important collector of Hebrew manuscripts, certainly in the 20th century, I would argue, who ever lived, certainly private collector of Hebrew manuscripts. He owned this book in 1929. As an important early owner of this book, we've named it after him. The current owner, Jackie Safra, seemed to have agreed. We didn't call it Keter Safra, we called it Keter Sassoon. And this is a crown motif up here. We're sort of looking for a non-Gothic looking crown. Someone asked me earlier, maybe this will be new, I don't know if you've heard this yet, what were these books sold for? Did you hear that already? Okay, well, we'll keep going anyhow. So Judah Schlanger mentioned to me that we have a note in another portion of a Bible that was sold. It's not a complete Bible, but it would have been of comparable importance, that it was sold for 37 gold dinar. And I asked her what that would have been worth. And she said that a family of 4 could have lived on a dinar and a half, a gold dinar and a half, for a month. So that means that they bought this book for something that a family of 4 could have lived on for close to 2 years, right? Something like that. So it's kind of intriguing that we know nothing about the Jewish community of Makisin. We do know, we have one mention that I've been able to find in Jewish sources. Many of you who are standing here will have heard of the Cairo Geniza, right? The Cairo Geniza is this vast repository. I'll explain for everybody, for the others who don't. Is this vast repository of documents that was found in this Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo. And there's a concept in Jewish culture that if you have something, a sacred text with God's name, or a text which has incurred holiness because it's the written prayers, even if it doesn't have God's name, you can't just throw it out. You have to put it in a repository. Sometimes it's buried very carefully. Sometimes it's put into the eaves of the synagogue. In the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo, which was built rebuilt in the 9th century, they created a room which is called a geniza, a repository. And in this room, they put all kinds of documents, not only sacred documents, but also basically documents written in Hebrew characters, whether they're Hebrew, whether they're Judeo-Arabic. They put merchants' letters, they put poetry, they put mathematical treatises. Anything that was written in Hebrew characters gets put into this repository, and for a millennia it sits there, and scholars in the 19th century and this is off topic slightly, but only a little bit, scholars in the 19th century come primarily from Western Europe and realize that this Geniza, there are many Genizot in the world. Basically, every community has multiple Genizot, but this is the most famous. Contained manuscripts for which no other source was known. So, like the missing Hebrew text of Ben Sira. It's another story. But in this repository, we find the papers of a very interesting individual, and his name was Obadiah the proselyte, Obadiah Hager. Is this new? Okay, there we go. So Obadiah Hager is a Norman priest who converts to Judaism a little bit before the year 1100. And he's in Italy, and once he converts, he decides that it would be safer if he moves to the Middle East, where it's not as frowned upon to convert from Christianity to Judaism, because the Muslims don't care that much, whether you're Christian or Jewish. Both are people of the book, and they were protected or not protected at various times. But he moves to the Middle East, and he's wandering, and he's traveling, I should say, from Aleppo to Baghdad, and then from Baghdad to Israel, and he ends up in Egypt, and he keeps a diary along the way, and his diary ends up in the Cairo Geniza. Okay, so this is a kind of long discursive to what's going on, and the pages of his diary have been discovered, and they're dispersed in several collections. Most of the Cairo Geniza was removed from Cairo. It was purchased by Solomon Schechter, and is now sitting in Cambridge. They have, I think, about 300,000 folios or documents from the Cairo Geniza. The other very large portion of the Cairo Geniza is sitting in New York, who purchased it from the collection of Elka Nathan Adler, and there are pages of Obadiah Hager in both places. And he writes that he's traveling. This is a long background, but it's sort of interesting. It's the only source we have of Makisin. He writes that he's traveling from Aleppo to Baghdad, and if you travel from Aleppo to Baghdad on a straight line, you pass through the city of Makisin, and he writes, I'm passing through the city of Makisin. That's all we know about it. So it's very interesting, actually, that this Bible, this very expensive, important Bible, is sitting there in a city that we don't know about. But one of the reasons for that might be because the next thing we know about this Bible is that the Jewish community of Makisin entrusts it to an individual, probably the most important individual in the community, and it appears that the synagogue was destroyed. The synagogue was destroyed, and this is the last page of the book, and you can see over here this sort of inscription down here. And this is again written in Judeo-Arabic, this Arabic language, but Hebrew characters. And it says that Salama ibn Abu al-Fakhar is entrusted with this book. And he is to guard it and watch it carefully, he and his heirs, until such time as the synagogue in Makisin will be rebuilt. And you can see on the bottom line here, Kadosh LaHashem LaKanisa Makisin. So it's dedicated to the synagogue in Makisin, but in the meanwhile, Salama is meant to take care of it. I can pass that around. When did this happen? Judah Schlanger thinks that it might have happened in one or two periods. We think that it was dedicated to the synagogue in the 13th century, based on looking at the script and comparing that script date-wise to other manuscripts of the time. And she thinks that in the 14th century, either in the early 14th century where the Mongols were coming through, or at the very end of the 14th century, and that's what she's leaning towards, when Tamerlane is taking exactly the same route as Obadiah Hager. He's going from Aleppo to Baghdad. On the way, apparently, he may have passed by the city of Makisin, which is on the Khyber River. It was a city of commercial importance, even though we don't know anything about the Jewish community there. And at that point, this transfer of ownership may have taken place, where it moves from the synagogue back into private ownership. We lose track of the Bible for the next 500 years. You're very welcome. Yes, no, they came in the last round of the first one. Come to New York and see the Sassoon exhibition. I think you'll enjoy it.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Can we take photos?
Yeah, you can take photos. Yeah, you can come closer and take photos. Actually, I think because it's in the case, I think we've allowed people to step closer, and you can. So we can move this away. You can come closer. we had those up when it was down. So where was I here? So we lose track of it, and the next thing we know about this Bible, it is offered for sale in the city of Frankfurt, and it's offered to Aaron Freiman. Aaron Freiman was the chief Judaica librarian in the Staatsbibliothek, which is the main the Staatsbibliothek in Frankfurt, which is the city library in Frankfurt, right? It's a very important library, and Aaron Freiman actually has the patronage of the Rothschilds, whose family came originally from Frankfurt, and they are giving him significant funds to buy really important Hebrew manuscripts. Did you want to see this? Yeah. Is that what you were pointing to? I don't know. Yeah, absolutely. This is what I was referring to down here. They're giving him significant funds, but for whatever reason he decides not to buy this Bible. We don't know why, because as a Jew he fled Nazi Germany, and most of his papers are lost. But what we do know is that he actually, when he decides not to buy it, he writes off to David Solomon Sassoon, and this is David Sassoon's bookplate. David Sassoon was, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the most important collector of Hebrew manuscripts, certainly in the 20th century, but perhaps who ever lived. And as I'm standing here in London, London had many important collections of Hebrew books. The other important collector, who some of you may remember, was Jack Lunzer, who had the most important private collection of printed Hebrew books. But so sort of comparing him to David Sassoon. Sassoon does buy this Bible. Bibles are one of the great loves, and it's something that he focused on in his collection. He wrote a 2-volume catalog. He was a very erudite collector. He wrote 2 volumes called Ohel David, where he catalogs all of his books. He begins with Bibles, and the last book in his catalog is this Bible, Sassoon 1053. It was one of the jewels in his crown, and we know that he paid more for this book than all but 4 other books in his collection of close to 1,300 manuscripts. So he understood the value. At that point, we knew, you can come closer, he knew that it was 10th century, but it was only when it was carbon dated by Jacques Safra that we actually have concrete proof that it is late 9th, early 10th century. David Sassoon lived until 1942. And in 1978, this Bible was sold as part of a series of sales of the Sassoon manuscript collection. There were, I think, 6 or 7 sales of the Sassoon collection that began in 1970, 1975, 1978, 1984, 1999, 2000, and this was sold in Zurich for about $320,000, 550,000 Swiss francs, and it was bought at that time by the British Rail Pension Fund, and they were buying not only Hebrew manuscripts, but they were buying paintings and other art objects and other rare books and manuscripts as an investment strategy. They were apparently criticized for this, but they actually did very well by this Bible because they sold it 11 years later for 10 times the price. They sold it for $3.19 million, which is pretty good if you think about it. And it made a world record price. $3.19 million was the second highest price ever paid for a book of any kind. It was bested only by the Gospels of Henry the Lion. So that was a very large number. When they owned it, they had it on deposit in the British Library. It was on exhibition exactly 40 years ago in 1982 as part of a small exhibition that the British Library put on of the books of David Sassoon. I think probably because the British Rail Pension Fund had put it on deposit there, and it was bought in. is the final part of the story, which is kind of amusing, but if some of you have heard it, with apologies. It was bought at that time, we say, by Jackie Safra, but actually the Washington Post reports, because everybody was very excited about this high price that the manuscript achieved, that it was bought by Mr. Toporowicz. So in the papers, it's published that Mr. Toporowicz bought it. They sent reporters to the auction house to see what it was going to be sold for. And Mr. Toporowicz, the hammer did go to him. He was a very high-end buyer of the most important Hebrew books and manuscripts. It's reported that he bought it with a partner. And why do we say that Jackie Safra bought it at the time? We say that because Jackie Safra is a passionate collector of both art and historical objects and Hebrew manuscripts. And he really wanted to buy it in 1989 when it came up for sale, but he heard that his Uncle Joseph would be bidding, and so he decided, out of respect to his Uncle Joseph, not to bid against him. And so he steps down, as he said to me, and he wakes up the next morning and finds in the newspaper that someone other than his Uncle Joseph now owns the book, and he's deeply unhappy about this. So it's public knowledge who's bought it, and he calls Sotheby's and he says, look, I'd like you to put me in touch with Mr. Toporowicz, because I'd like to buy the Bible from him. He's bought it, but I'd like to own it. And they do put him in touch with Mr. Toporowicz. Mr. Toporowicz has not yet purchased the Bible. He hasn't paid Sotheby's yet. So Jackie Safra says, well, I'd like to buy this from you. And Mr. Toporowicz is a dealer. He said, that's fine, it'll be $1 million more than the hammer price. Jackie says that he paid that. I mean, I can't guarantee that, but I see no reason to Jackie to be lying about that amount. But Mr. Toporowicz apparently decides that it's inconvenient to bother to send Sotheby's the money and then have Sotheby's sell it back to Jackie Safra. So he says to Jackie, you send me the $1 million, I send the 3.19 to Sotheby's, and we'll call it square. And so the buyer on record who paid for the manuscript at Sotheby's is Jackie Safra. He's owned it for the last 3 decades. He's given access to scholars. Yossi Ofer, who's one of the lead scholars of Masorah, of the Masoretic text that appears here, has been studying it. Other scholars have studied it. He's digitized the manuscript. It is available digitally on the National Library website in Israel. It's a wonderful website, and you can actually turn the pages there, which I can't do here because Sotheby's Risk thinks that it would be prudent to keep it in a case most of the time, and I don't necessarily disagree with them. It's important to be careful about risk and security, but you can see it and you can turn the pages there, and we're excited to find who the next important guardian of this Hebrew manuscript will be, the earliest, most complete Codex of the Hebrew Bible. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you have questions, I would be happy to take them. There's sort of lots of information that I can spiel about this book. Yes, it's for sale now. Oh, yes.
What's the guide price?
So the estimate on this is 30 to 50 million US dollars. I say 30 to 50, and people say, is that pounds or dollars? And I often think to myself, does it really make a difference at that? But it is dollars. It's 30 to 50 million US dollars. And the way that we get to that is that we looked at comparables, and the comparables, for example, are other signally important documents. We sold the Constitution of the United States last year for $43 million. That was a printed document of which there are multiples, and we thought, well, this is the earliest, most complete Hebrew Bible. Another one like it is not going to come around again.
Where are you from?
I'm from New York. Can't tell, I don't have a
But I didn't know if you travelled.
So I've traveled. I've traveled, but I'm not in charge. We have wonderful security, both in Sotheby's London and Sotheby's New York, and they actually pack it up very, very well. And Shannon from